The moon hung high, a pale silver eye watching the world with silent judgment. Its light spilled across the grand courtyard of the Crescent Fangpak, where hundreds had gathered, their breath misting in the cold air, their hearts pounding in eager anticipation. Tonight was supposed to be sacred, the night when bonds were revealed, when the goddess herself whispered fates into mortal hearts. But fate, it seemed, was about to show its cruelest face. Alara stood at the center of the pack's gaze. She was small, fragile, with hair like molten gold and eyes the color of the forest after rain. An Omega by birth, the lowest rank, the overlooked, the forgotten. Her trembling hands clutched the ceremonial robe tighter as her heart begged to believe that the rumors were wrong, that the pull she felt was real, that her mate, her destiny, would not destroy her before the night even ended. The Alpha Heir stood before her, tall and radiant under the moonlight. His presence alone silenced the wind. He was power and pride personified, the kind of man legends were built around. And as his piercing gaze met hers, Alara's heart leapt, because she knew. The bond shimmered in her veins, ancient and unbreakable. The moon goddess had chosen him for her. But destiny, sometimes, is not kind to the weak. The air shifted, the crowd murmured, and with a single, sharp breath, the Alpha Heir spoke the words that would shatter her world. His rejection was not loud, yet it echoed like thunder. The bond snapped, invisible but violent, and something inside her broke so completely that even the goddess turned her eyes away. Laughter rippled through the ranks of wolves. The elite smirked. Some pitied her. Most didn't bother to hide their disgust. Alara, the rejected Omega. A curse to any who dared love her. A stain in a world built on hierarchy and strength. The moonlight dimmed. The cold grew sharper. And Alara's legs gave way beneath her as she fell to her knees in the dust, clutching her chest as if she could hold together the fragments of her soul. No one moved to help her. Not a single soul dared defy the Alpha's will. Rejection meant exile. It meant she no longer belonged to anyone, not the pack, not the goddess, not even the earth beneath her feet. When she finally stood, her eyes were hollow. The warmth that once lived within them had turned to ice. Without a word, she turned and walked into the night, her bare feet bleeding on the stones, her tears lost to the wind. Behind her, the laughter continued. The bondless girl was gone, and none cared enough to stop her. Beyond the edge of the pack's lands lay the cursed forest, a place no wolf dared to enter. Ancient, vast, and alive with whispers of spirits and lost souls, it was said that those who entered never returned. But Alara did not hesitate. For what could the forest take that she hadn't already lost? The branches clawed at her skin as she stumbled through the thorns. Her blood marked her path like crimson flowers blooming in the moonlight. She didn't feel the pain, only the emptiness, the silence, the endless echo of the words that had ruined her. Hours passed. The forest grew thicker, darker. The wind carried voices, low, guttural sounds that didn't belong to the human world. Eyes gleamed in the darkness, countless and unblinking. The wolves were watching. Their growls rose like a chorus of ghosts. Their presence was primal, ancient, a force untouched by civilization or mercy. And yet, when the largest of them stepped forward, fur black as night, eyes like molten silver, Alara did not run. She stood still, trembling but unyielding, her gaze locked with his. There was no fear left to claim her. The wolf circled her once. Twice. The air between them shimmered, charged with something that defied words, not a threat, not a bond, but recognition. Something in her blood answered the call. Something older than pack, older than kings, older than curses. The wolf turned, and the rest followed. They melted into the forest shadows, but not before glancing back, as if inviting her into their world. And Alara, the rejected Omega, followed. The moon drifted higher as she crossed the unseen threshold between the world of men and the realm of beasts. Behind her, her past burned to ash. Ahead, the unknown waited, vast, wild, untamed. That night, the pack lost an Omega. But the forest gained a legend. The whispers began soon after, tales of a girl who vanished into the cursed forest and was never seen again. Some said she was devoured. Some said she became one of them. But the truth would be far stranger. For in the heart of the wilderness, under the gaze of the immortal moon, Alara did not die. She was reborn, among the wild, among the forgotten, among the wolves. And somewhere, deep within that endless forest, a pair of silver eyes watched her every step, guarding her like a vow unbroken. The forest accepted her. The night embraced her. And the story that began with rejection was only beginning to unfold. It was alive, ancient and untamed, a labyrinth of shadows and light where time itself seemed to kneel before the old magic that ruled it. The air hung heavy with mist and memory, every whisper of wind carrying stories of those who had entered and never returned. It was said that the forest devoured souls. But for Alara, it felt strangely like coming home. The first night passed without sleep. She wandered beneath towering pines that reached toward the heavens like black spears. The moon followed her, a silent companion, casting its pale glow on her pale, blood-streaked skin. Her feet were torn, her robe tattered, but still, she moved, aimless, breath shallow, driven by the faint hum of something unseen calling from deeper within. Each rustle in the undergrowth was a reminder that she was not alone. Eyes watched from every corner, eyes that gleamed gold, amber, crimson, and silver. The forest was never still. It shifted and breathed around her, whispering secrets in a tongue older than words. Yet none of its dangers struck. The wolves, wild and feral, circled her silently, as if bound by some unspoken law. When dawn broke, it came without warmth. The mist clung to the ground, and the light filtered through it like liquid silver. Alara found herself standing before a lake, vast, still, and perfectly mirrored. The reflection that stared back at her was a stranger, hollow eyes, trembling hands, and a face carved from grief. The mark of rejection, faint and glowing, pulsed just above her heart, the cruel symbol of what she'd lost. She knelt at the water's edge, touching the surface with her fingertips. Ripples spread outward, distorting her reflection into something monstrous, something wild. For the first time, she wondered if the moon goddess had cursed her, or chosen her for something far greater. A low growl rumbled through the air. From the fog, shadows began to emerge, massive forms, graceful and terrifying. Wolves. Dozens of them. Their fur shimmered like molten metal beneath the sunlight, and their eyes burned with intelligence far beyond the beast. Alara didn't move. The largest among them stepped forward, the black wolf with eyes like liquid silver. He was larger than any creature she'd ever seen, his aura radiating dominance and danger. He stopped mere paces from her, head lowered, his gaze locked on hers. There was no sound but the whisper of the lake and the beating of her heart. Then, slowly, deliberately, the wolf lay down before her, his massive head resting on the earth. The others followed, lowering themselves in a strange, reverent silence. Something in that moment shifted. The forest no longer felt hostile. The mist no longer seemed cold. For the first time since her rejection, Alara felt seen, not as an omega, not as a castaway, but as something more. Days became nights, and nights became weeks. Time in the forest had no meaning. The wolves moved like shadows, silent and sure. They hunted when hunger called, shared their kills when she was near, and guarded her when the darkness deepened. She learned to read their eyes, their movements, the language of their silence. They accepted her, not as prey, not as threat, but as kin. She built a small shelter by the lake, weaving branches and moss with trembling hands. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She learned which berries would not kill her, which streams carried clean water, which paths led deeper into their domain. The black wolf was always there, watching. He never came too close, never touched her, yet his presence was a constant, like the moon itself, patient and unyielding. At night, she could feel his gaze even when he was hidden among the trees. Sometimes she'd wake to find him standing by the edge of her shelter, silent, protective. One evening, as the forest burned gold beneath the dying sun, she watched the wolves gather on the cliffs. They howled, a song of power, sorrow, and longing that reached the heavens. The sound filled her chest until tears spilled down her cheeks. For the first time, she understood, they weren't just beasts. They were cursed. Each howl was a memory, each note a prayer to a goddess who had long forgotten them. The forest listened. The moon rose. And Alara, the rejected one, howled back. Her voice was fragile at first, cracked and human, but as the night deepened, it grew strong, almost otherworldly. The wolves paused, turning toward her, their eyes wide. The silver-eyed alpha lifted his head and joined her call, his voice blending with hers until the forest trembled beneath their shared song. In that harmony, something ancient stirred. The wind shifted, the trees bent, the lake rippled with unseen power. And when silence finally fell, the wolves did not move for a long time. From that night onward, Alara was no longer a stranger. She hunted beside them, slept among them, and healed their wounds with herbs she'd learned to find in the shadows. She spoke little, yet her heart beat in rhythm with theirs. The loneliness that had once threatened to consume her was replaced by something strange and new, belonging. Still, there were moments when she'd catch sight of the silver-eyed wolf beneath the moon and feel a pull she couldn't name. His gaze was too human, too sorrowful, as if he carried lifetimes of pain beneath his fur. There was a story in his silence, a truth in his watchful eyes that called to something deep within her. But she didn't ask, and he didn't answer. The forest had its secrets, and some were not ready to be told. The years began to slip through her fingers like sand. Seasons turned, trees grew, rivers carved new paths. The world outside forgot the name Alara, but the forest never did. Under the moon's gaze, she changed. Her hair grew long and wild, her skin tanned beneath endless suns. Her eyes, once dimmed by sorrow, glowed with the reflection of the moon. She moved like the wolves now, quiet, fluid, fierce. She was no longer the fragile girl who had been rejected. She had become something else, something untamed. Something eternal. And though she didn't yet know it, the wolf with silver eyes, the one who had watched her every step, was not merely her guardian. He was the alpha king of an ancient bloodline, cursed to roam in the form of a beast until the bond he'd once denied returned to him. And as the moon rose higher, bathing them both in its silver light, destiny stirred once again, silent but unstoppable, weaving the first threads of a love story that time itself could not destroy. Time in the forest had no beginning, no end. Days and nights blurred together under the ceaseless watch of the moon, and the air itself seemed to hum with secrets older than any mortal memory. Alara had become a shadow among shadows, her footsteps silent upon the leaf-strewn ground, her hair tangled with moss and the scent of the earth. She had learned to read the language of the trees, the whispers of the wind, the pulse of the rivers. She understood the rhythm of the wolves, their moods, their fears, their strengths. Yet there remained one she could never fully understand, the silver-eyed wolf. He appeared at the edge of her vision more often now, emerging from the mist like a phantom of the forest. His fur glimmered like molten midnight beneath the moonlight, and his eyes, molten silver, carried a weight that no beast should bear. When he looked at her, it was as if the centuries themselves had folded into that gaze, folding love and sorrow, regret and longing, into a silence too heavy for words. For weeks, she had tried to speak to him, to call him closer, to coax him into trust, but he remained distant, a guardian and a mystery entwined in one. And yet, every day, she found herself drawn to him, her heartbeat matching the silent rhythm of his own. One morning, as dawn broke through the mist like liquid gold spilling over the forest, Alara awoke to the distant sound of the alpha's howl. It was not a call to the pack, nor a warning, it was a song. It was a vow, resonant and haunting, carried across the hills and valleys of the wild. Her soul shivered at the sound, and without knowing why, she began to answer. Her voice rose from deep within, trembling at first, but growing stronger with each note. The silver-eyed wolf appeared then, his head raised, his chest trembling as he added his own voice to hers. The two sounds intertwined, weaving a tapestry of emotion that filled the forest with energy. It was a song of protection, a song of promise, a song that spoke of bonds beyond human understanding. Alara fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, as the wolf approached. He did not bow his head in submission, nor did he act with aggression. Instead, he circled her slowly, sniffing the air around her, studying her with an intensity that made her heart ache. In a motion so sudden it stole her breath, he pressed his massive head against her shoulder, and for the first time, she felt his warmth, the pulse of his life against her own. In that instant, she understood something she had not dared to hope for. The wolf had chosen her. Not as a protector, not as prey, but as kin. His eyes, though still molten silver, softened with something that resembled trust. It was a promise, unspoken but unbreakable, that he would guard her, guide her, and never abandon her. Days turned into weeks, and Alara settled into a rhythm with the pack. She moved with them, hunted with them, and learned the ways of the forest. But it was never enough to simply exist. She began to notice the small things. The way the silver-eyed wolf would stand guard while she slept, the way he would return before the others if she wandered too far, the quiet moments when his gaze lingered on her in the silver glow of the moon. It was during one of these nights that the promise became clear. The forest had fallen silent, the wind had stilled, and the moon hung full and bright above them. Alara sat beside the lake, tending to a small wound on her arm, when the wolf approached. He stopped mere inches away, his breath fogging the cold air, and slowly, deliberately, he lay down beside her. His head rested on her lap, his massive body a shield between her and the shadows. She reached out instinctively, brushing her fingers through his fur, and in that touch, a bond formed, deeper than the bond of pack, deeper than the ties of blood. It was a promise that transcended time, a silent vow that neither rejection nor fate could sever. Alara closed her eyes, letting the moonlight wash over her, letting the warmth of his body seep into her soul. For the first time in her long, lonely life, she felt a sense of belonging. She felt as if she had finally found a place where she was safe, where she was loved, and where the scars of her past no longer held power over her. The wolves around her remained vigilant, but they too seemed to recognize the change. There was a new respect in their eyes, a quiet understanding that the silver-eyed alpha had made his choice, and that the omega he had chosen was no longer alone. Weeks passed. The bond between Alara and the silver-eyed wolf grew stronger. She began to anticipate his movements, to feel his presence even when he was not visible. She could sense his moods, his fears, and his silent joys. And though he remained a creature of the forest, bound by instincts and the centuries of a curse she did not yet understand, she felt the stirrings of something more, a connection that went beyond trust, beyond companionship, beyond even love. One evening, as the first snow of winter fell, covering the forest in a blanket of sylve, Alara found herself alone with the wolf atop a cliff that overlooked the forest. The moon was full, reflecting off the snow and casting long shadows across the landscape. She looked at him and whispered, though he could not understand words, "I am yours." The wolf lifted his head, and for a long moment, his eyes held hers. It was not a look of acknowledgement, nor a look of desire, nor a look of domination. It was a look that said, without words, without gestures, without sound, "I am yours too. Always." In that silent moment, the forest seemed to sigh. The trees shivered. The wind carried their promise across the valleys. And Alara knew, deep in her soul, that the century ahead, however long, however lonely, however dangerous, would not be faced alone. For the wolf had made his promise. And she had accepted it. The forest had become her home. The wolves, her family. And the silver-eyed alpha, her eternal protector. Yet beyond the veil of leaves and moonlight, beyond the shadows of time and the frozen secrets of the forest, a truth lingered. A truth that neither the wolf nor the omega yet realized, that the Alpha King, cursed and hidden, had once walked among humans. That he had loved, that he had lost, and that their destinies were intertwined in a bond older than the forest itself. And the century of silence, the century of survival, the century of waiting, it had only just begun. Time in the forest moved differently. Days, months, and years fell away like dead leaves carried by a river, leaving behind only the rhythm of the wild, the heartbeat of the earth, and the pulse of the moon. Alara no longer counted the years. They counted her. She became part of the forest, as inseparable as the rivers, the ancient trees, and the shadows that stretched beneath the moonlight. Seasons cycled endlessly. Winters came with biting winds that stole breath, summers scorched the earth with unrelenting sun, springs painted the forest in fleeting colors, and autumns rained gold and crimson. Yet through all this, Alara remained unchanged. Her hair lengthened, tangled with leaves and frost, her skin carried the bronze of countless suns, and her eyes, the eyes of a girl who had once wept beneath rejection, now glimmered with the clarity of one who had seen centuries pass. The wolves were her constant companions. They moved around her with effortless synchronicity, hunting together, sleeping together, surviving together. They were fierce, untamable, yet beneath the raw power, they understood her in ways no human ever had. Every gesture, every glance, every silent signal between them became a language, a code of trust and belonging. The silver-eyed wolf remained the center of this world, a shadow that never left her side. He was both sentinel and teacher, guiding her through the complexities of the forest. She learned which plants could heal, which roots could feed, which streams ran clear, which paths were safe. She learned to move as silently as the wind, to strike when necessary, to observe without being seen. The wolf's lessons were patient, tireless, and spoken. And in his presence, she learned the meaning of patience, strength, and quiet endurance. Centuries passed, though Alara did not mark them. She watched empires rise and fall beyond the forest's borders in whispers carried by wandering travelers or lost scrolls that drifted into the woods. She never ventured beyond the trees. The world outside had rejected her once, and she had no desire to return. The humans she once knew were as distant as the stars. She was a creature of the forest now, wild and eternal, her soul entwined with the wolves in ways that could not be undone. And yet, despite the harmony she had found, there was always the silver-eyed wolf, an unspoken presence that stirred something deep within her. He would appear silently at her side, as if materializing from the mist itself, his gaze heavy with emotion she could not name. At times, she felt his sorrow, a deep, gnawing emptiness that mirrored her own. Other times, she sensed a fierce longing, a need to protect, to remain close, to keep her safe from the unseen threats that lurked in the world beyond the trees. She came to understand that the wolf was more than a guardian. He was a puzzle she could not solve, a story left unfinished, a history bound to her own in ways she did not yet comprehend. There were nights when she would lie beneath the stars, tracing the constellations with her fingertips, wondering what fate had created this strange bond between a human and a wolf, between an immortal girl and a creature who carried centuries in his gaze. Time in the forest was not entirely peaceful. Storms came with fury, tearing branches from trees, washing away the ground in torrents of rain. Predators occasionally strayed into her domain, testing her and her pack. But the wolves were always there, countless eyes, countless teeth, countless hearts beating in unison to protect the one who had become their own. And through it all, Alara grew stronger. She became agile, precise, attuned to every rustle in the leaves, every whisper in the wind, every subtle shift in the forest's energy. It was during the 100th year that the forest itself seemed to pause. The wind held its breath, the rivers slowed their flow, and the moon shone brighter than it ever had before. Alara had grown fully into her power. Her voice, when she sang, could carry for miles, bending the forest to her will. Her presence was like a beacon, a call to all who roamed the wilderness. And yet, despite her strength, she still did not know the wolf's true nature, that he was not merely a guardian of flesh and fur, but the Alpha King, cursed to walk the world as a beast until the bond he had once denied returned to him. The wolf watched her silently, as he always had, his gaze lingering longer than before. There were moments when he would step closer, hesitating, as if the centuries of silence and sorrow weighed on him as much as on her. And though she did not yet understand, she felt the stirrings of a connection deeper than the bond of survival, deeper than the bond of companionship. It was a bond older than time itself, bound by fate, by destiny, and by the unspoken promises of the heart. On nights when the moon reached its zenith, she would hear him howl. Not as a wolf, not as a warning, not as a declaration of territory, but as a song of longing, of memory, of love trapped in a form that could not speak. And she would answer, her own howl rising to meet his, weaving a melody that carried through the centuries, reaching the edges of the forest, calling to the spirits, calling to the stars, calling to a fate that neither of them fully understood. Alara lived as the forest lived, untamed and eternal. She healed the wounded, guided the lost, and nurtured the delicate balance of life and death that governed her domain. The wolves thrived under her care, growing stronger, more coordinated, more attuned to her rhythm. They were not merely companions, they were extensions of her soul, the embodiment of the centuries she had survived, the guardians of the girl who had been rejected but had never truly fallen. And through it all, the silver-eyed wolf never left her side. He was a shadow and a presence, a mystery and a truth, a constant reminder that even in the silence of 100 years, destiny was never idle. The century of silence passed. And when it ended, the forest was ready to reveal the secrets it had kept hidden. For the wolf who watched her so faithfully was no longer merely a protector. He was the Alpha King, cursed to wander in fur and shadow, whose heart had once belonged to her and whose destiny was forever entwined with hers. And the moment of revelation, though centuries away, was stirring even now, a heartbeat in the forest, a sigh of fate, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Alara, the rejected Omega, had lived 100 years among wolves. She had survived rejection, exile, and solitude. She had become immortal in body, spirit, and mind. And yet, despite all she had endured, she had never truly been alone. The century of silence had prepared her. The century of wolves had protected her. And the century of waiting had kept the Alpha King close, watching, waiting, ready for the day they would finally meet again. The forest, vast and untamed, had known peace for a century. It had cradled Alara in its shadowed embrace, teaching her its rhythms, sharing its secrets, and sheltering her from a world that had once cast her aside. The wolves moved like shadows, silent and precise, the very essence of wild harmony. But peace is a fragile thing. And in the world beyond the ancient trees, time had not forgotten the forest, nor the legends whispered by travelers who dared to wander near its edge. Hunters came first. They did not see a girl or a woman, nor a guardian wolf or a living pack. They saw a prize, a story to tell, a trophy to claim. They carried steel and fire, their arrogance sharpened by years of conquest and ignorance. They knew nothing of the forest's old magic, the bonds that wove together beast and human, or the silent vow that had held Alara and the wolves together for 100 years. The first intruders stepped lightly upon the moss-covered earth, yet the forest shivered beneath their feet. Birds scattered in frantic flurries, leaves rustled in warning, and shadows shifted, as if the trees themselves whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Alara sensed the disturbance before she saw them. Her instincts, honed over a century, tingled in her bones. She did not panic. She did not run. She moved like a wraith, her bare feet silent against the soil, her eyes scanning, her senses alive with the forest's warning. The wolves appeared before her, a living wall of fur and teeth, silent but menacing. They had learned her language, and in their silent coordination, they were unstoppable. The silver-eyed wolf emerged at the forefront, his presence commanding, his gaze sharper than any blade. He was a sentinel of ancient power, a being who had waited a century for this moment, a protector whose loyalty knew no bounds. The hunters laughed. They thought they had stumbled upon an unguarded realm. They did not see the glint of intelligence in the wolves' eyes, the strength that pulsed beneath their sinew, the history and magic that had grown stronger with every year Alara had lived among them. Steel met fang, shouts met growls, fire met shadow, and yet, despite the chaos, Alara moved with a grace that belonged neither to human nor beast. She guided her pack, directing their movements, teaching them where to strike and when to retreat. Her century in the forest had honed her into a master of survival, a phantom queen whose presence alone could turn the tide of life and death. Still, the wolves were not enough to fully shield her from the intrusion. One hunter, reckless and arrogant, pressed too close. He aimed his weapon at her, oblivious to the danger, blinded by greed and hubris. And in that instant, the silver-eyed wolf lunged, a shadow and a strike combined, intercepting the threat. His massive body collided with steel, his growl tearing through the forest like a warning from the gods themselves. Alara's heart raced. The wolf had been wounded. A thin streak of blood ran along his flank, dark against the black fur that shimmered in the moonlight. She rushed to his side, ignoring the chaos around her, kneeling on the forest floor as she pressed her hands against the wound. Heat and life pulsed through her fingers. She whispered to him, soft sounds carried on the wind, soothing the pain she could not erase. Time seemed to slow. The hunters froze as if the forest itself had held them in place. The wolves formed a circle, growling low and menacing, their collective presence radiating power and warning. And Alara, kneeling beside the silver-eyed Alpha, felt the depth of their bond. She was no longer a rejected Omega, no longer fragile, no longer alone. She was the pulse of the forest, the center of its strength, and the guardian of its secrets. The hunters scattered eventually, some fleeing with fear, others falling to the forest's judgment. The wolves pursued none, they had only protected. They had only guarded what was theirs. And when silence returned, it was absolute, heavy, and filled with the whispers of the forest itself. The alpha wolf lay still beneath her hands, eyes softening as he met hers. Pain lingered, yes, but there was also a recognition, a confirmation that even after a century, their connection remained unbroken, unyielding, eternal. And as she tended to his wound, she felt something stirring in the depths of the forest. A truth she had long forgotten, a history older than the trees, a bond older than the century that had passed. For the wolf who had protected her, who had watched over her through 100 years of silence and solitude, was not merely a beast. He carried a name, a crown, a legacy. He was the Alpha King, cursed to roam the earth in fur and shadow, whose heart had once been human, whose soul had once been hers. And now, at the edge of intrusion, at the clash of worlds, the veil that had hidden him was beginning to thin. Alara pressed her forehead to his fur, feeling the warmth, the heartbeat, the strength that had been her constant through 100 years. The forest held its breath. The moon hung higher. And for the first time, in the chaos of intrusion, she understood that the century of silence was ending. A new chapter was beginning. And it would demand more than survival. It would demand truth. It would demand courage. It would demand love. The Alpha King, though still a wolf, was watching her. Waiting. And she, the rejected Omega who had lived 100 years among wolves, was ready to face whatever lay ahead, unaware that the truths of their past, the curses of their fate, and the NDS of their hearts were about to collide in ways that would change both their worlds forever. The forest had settled into a fragile calm. The echoes of the hunter's intrusion lingered in the shadows, whispers of fear and fire that had dared to trespass upon this ancient realm. Yet for Alara, the battle was far from over. Her hand still tingled with the memory of the wolf's heat beneath her palms, his fur slicked with blood and sweat, and his eyes, molten silver, had carried a weight that reached deeper than the century they had shared together. For days, she tended to him. She cleaned the wound, applied the poultices of herbs she had learned to find over decades, and whispered to him, though he understood nothing but the tone, the care, the presence. Time moved slowly in the forest, yet each moment stretched endlessly when life teetered on a knife's edge. The silver-eyed wolf was more than a protector. He was her anchor, her constant, the shadow that had followed her for 100 years without falter. And now, seeing him wounded, she felt the sting of fear she had thought long buried. The wound was not deep, yet it ran along the flank of his shoulder, cruelly positioned where movement was essential. Every step he took caused a shiver of pain to run through his massive frame. He refused to howl, refused to show weakness, but Alara could see it in the tightening of his muscles, the flicker of his eyes, the way his breath came in shallow, controlled bursts. As she sat beside him beneath the moonlight, her fingers tracing the edges of the wound, she felt something stir in the air, a change, subtle but undeniable. The forest itself seemed to lean closer, the leaves whispering in anticipation, the wind carrying a scent of something ancient and forgotten. And then, for the first time, she noticed it, the shape of a man beneath the silver sheen of fur. It was brief, almost imperceptible. The wolf's massive form shivered, and for a heartbeat, the fur seemed to ripple, transforming into the faint outline of a human figure beneath. Eyes still molten silver, gaze still fierce, yet softened, vulnerable, human. And then the illusion faded. The fur returned, the massive body was once more the alpha wolf, and Alara, breathless and trembling, could only wonder if what she had seen was a trick of moonlight, exhaustion, or something far more profound. The nights that followed were heavy with tension. The wolf grew restless, circling more often, his movements tense, his gaze locked on distant shadows. Alara followed instinctively, moving beside him, matching his silent pace. She spoke softly to him, her voice threading through the darkness, weaving comfort where it was needed, coaxing him with care and patience. And then, one night, as the moon hung impossibly all above them, a shift occurred that neither had expected. The wolf, sensing her presence, pressed close, his head resting upon her lap. But this time, when she looked into his eyes, she saw more than silver. She saw memories, flashes of a human life, a crown lost, a throne abandoned, a love betrayed. Her breath caught. The centuries of silence, the 100 years of solitude, and the countless nights spent under the moon all seemed to converge in that one gaze. The forest held its breath. Even the wolves, her family, her companions, stood still, sensing that a moment of reckoning was near. Alara's hands moved instinctively, stroking the wolf's fur, her fingers brushing against something warm and familiar beneath, not just the body of the beast, but the pulse of a human heartbeat hidden beneath the skin. And then, as if the world itself had shifted, the wolf's body trembled. Fur rippled, muscles tightened, and the form of a man emerged beneath the silver sheen. He fell to his knees, gasping, human and beast in one, his eyes locked on hers, molten silver softened into recognition, sorrow, and longing. Alara, he whispered, his voice raw, ancient, and achingly familiar. The sound carried across the forest like a song long forgotten, striking chords deep within her heart. She stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face, for the name, her name, spoken by a voice that belonged not to the wild, but to the man who had been denied to her all those centuries ago. He was the Alpha King, cursed into the form of a wolf, his human identity hidden beneath fur and instinct. And now, wounded, weakened, yet alive, he revealed himself in fragments, each one a testament to the bond that had never truly broken. He was the guardian, the sentinel, the love she had never forgotten, and the man she had once longed for. The forest seemed to close in around them. Shadows deepened, the moon glowed brighter, and the wind carried the scent of something eternal, destiny, fate, and love intertwined. Alara reached out, placing her hand against his cheek, and felt the warmth of the man beneath the beast, the pulse of life, and the years of sorrow condensed into this single, fragile moment. He winced, pain coursing through his body, yet he did not pull away. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers, and in that gesture, centuries of longing, rejection, and silence spoke more eloquently than words ever could. The wolves circled, silent, protective, understanding. They knew their alpha's truth, had witnessed the bond unfold across a century of isolation, and now recognized that the one he had been guarding was not just a survivor, but his mate, his other half, the Omega who had been rejected but had endured all. Tears blurred Alara's vision, but she smiled through them. The century of silence was ending. The century of waiting had borne fruit. And though the forest had grown quiet after the night of revelation, a hush that seemed to hang in the air as if the trees themselves had paused to witness a miracle long overdue. The silver-eyed wolf, now revealed in glimpses of his human form, lay beside Alara, his massive body still tinged with the rawness of the wound she had tended. And yet, in those moments of quiet, the weight of centuries pressed down upon them both, centuries of separation, of sorrow, of promises denied and fates altered. Alara traced her fingers along his jaw, along the curve of his human features beneath the fur, feeling the pulse of life, the warmth of a heart that had endured exile and curse. She could sense his memories, faint flickers that shimmered in his eyes. A throne lost to betrayal, a pack fractured by ambition, a kingdom swallowed by darkness. But most of all, she felt the memory of her, of herself, the rejected Omega he had once denied, the one he had once forsaken in pride and fear. He spoke little, his voice rough, broken by centuries of silence, yet each word carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. I remember, he breathed, and the pause that followed was heavier than any sentence could carry. He remembered her rejection, yes, but more profoundly, he remembered the bond that had been severed by circumstance, by deceit, by pride. And in that remembrance lay the seed of what had been lost, and what could still be reclaimed. Alara's heart trembled. For 100 years, she had lived in the forest, learning its rhythms, surviving its trials, forming a bond with a wolf she did not yet fully understand. But now, the truth was clear. The Alpha King had always been near her, always watching, always guarding, even as he bore the curse that had turned him into the beast she had come to trust. His loyalty had never wavered. His love had never faded. They spent long days in silence, their presence alone speaking volumes the tongue could not capture. She would gather herbs and clean his wound, and he would watch her, human form or wolf, the same intensity in his gaze that spoke of memory, regret, and longing. Occasionally, he would sit upright, his fur rippling like liquid silver, and she would catch glimpses of his true self. A king in exile, a man of sorrow and pride, a soul forged in hardship. It was in one of these moments, as the sun filtered through the canopy in golden rays, that he began to speak more fully, recounting fragments of his past. He told her of the pack that had once been his, the wars fought for territory and honor, the betrayals that had led to his curse. He spoke of the humans who had feared him, of allies turned enemies, of a throne that had been lost not by strength but by deception. And always, in the midst of these tales, he spoke of her, the Omega he had once rejected, the mate he had never ceased to love, the one whose absence had haunted him through centuries of exile. Alara listened, her tears falling freely, each drop a testament to the time they had lost. She realized that their bond had never truly been broken. Rejection had been an obstacle, not a severance. The curse had hidden him from her, had forced him to live as a shadow among shadows, yet it had not diminished the connection that fate had woven into their souls. As the days passed, the Alpha King's human form grew stronger. The wolf within him still lingered, a reminder of the curse and the life he had endured, but the man was returning, slowly, painfully, beautifully. The forest seemed to hold its breath that night, as if even the wind and trees waited in reverent silence for the unveiling of a truth older than time itself. The moon hung full and luminous above the canopy, spilling silver light over the earth and illuminating every leaf, every ripple of the lake, every glimmering eye of the wolves that had lived 100 years in devotion and secrecy. It was a light that had seen centuries pass, that had watched the Alpha King's exile and the Omega's solitude, that had borne witness to suffering and resilience alike. Alara sat beside the silver-eyed Alpha, her hand resting on the pulse of his heart, feeling its rhythm merge with her own. Though he had regained much of his human form, the wolf within him remained, primal and eternal, a reminder of the curse that had bound him to the forest, and to her, across time itself. She could sense his unease, the tremor beneath his strength, the centuries of pain locked behind those molten eyes. And in that moment, she realized that what he needed was not merely healing of flesh, but revelation, a truth that only the moon goddess herself could grant. The night deepened, shadows lengthened, the forest was alive with a presence that Alara had felt but never fully understood. And then, as if summoned by the weight of their entwined destinies, a figure appeared, luminous, ethereal, more light than flesh, descending from the heavens with a grace that made the very air shimmer. The moon goddess had come. Her gaze fell upon Alara first, and the Omega felt a warmth unlike any she had known, a light that seeped into the deepest corners of her being. She saw herself reflected in that light, not as a rejected girl, not as a fragile soul abandoned by fate, but as a being of power, resilience, and ancient purpose. The moon goddess spoke, and though her words were soft, they carried across the forest like a tide that washed away centuries of doubt. You have endured, the goddess said, her voice a melody of wind and starlight. You have survived rejection, exile, and solitude. You have lived with the wolves, learned their language, embraced their strength. And yet, your path has always been intertwined with one who has been hidden from you, the Alpha King, your fated mate, cursed by envy and treachery to walk as a wolf until the bond of true love awakened him. Alara's breath caught. She looked at the Alpha King, who knelt beside her, his eyes wide, molten silver softened by tears he had long denied. The goddess's gaze encompassed them both, revealing the centuries of pain, the layers of misunderstanding, the manipulation of fate itself by forces jealous of their union. Your separation was never your choice, the goddess continued. The curse was cast to test your bond, to strengthen your spirits, to allow the forest and its denizens to prepare you for what is to come. Now the time has arrived. He has returned, but the final truth must be embraced. The century of silence, the century of survival, the century of waiting has prepared you both to fulfill the destiny written in your blood. Alara's hands shook as she absorbed the words. 100 years of pain, a century of solitude, a lifetime of lessons and endurance, all converged in that moment. She understood, fully and completely, that nothing, neither rejection, nor curse, nor exile, had ever diminished the bond between her and the Alpha King. It had only been tempered, like steel forged in fire, made unbreakable. The Alpha King's form shimmered, wolf and man balanced on the edge of revelation. He lifted his head, gaze meeting hers, and in that instant, centuries of longing, sorrow, and love poured into a single unspoken truth. They were fated, eternally bound, and the universe itself had conspired to bring them together despite all odds. The moon goddess raised her hands, and a silver light cascaded over the forest, bathing the wolves, the lake, the trees, and the lovers in an ethereal glow. The Alpha King trembled as the curse that had held him in fur and shadow for a century began to weaken. His form shifted, subtle at first, then more pronounced, muscles relaxing, fur receding, until the man who had once walked the earth in pride and sorrow stood fully before Alara. The wolves howled in unison, a song of recognition and release, of loyalty fulfilled and centuries endured. They encircled the couple, but their growls softened, their eyes reverent, acknowledging that the bond they had protected was not merely survival, but destiny. Alara reached out, her fingers brushing his face, her tears falling freely. "It's you," she whispered. "It's always been you." He smiled through the ache of centuries, the memory of exile, the pain of solitude. "And it has always been you," he said, voice trembling. "Through every shadow, every night, every century, I have waited for you." The moon goddess's light pulsed once more, bathing them in silver radiance. "Now," she said, her voice echoing like music through the forest, "the curse is broken, the bond is acknowledged, and the time of reunion has come. Walk together as mates, as Alpha and Omega, as equals in love and destiny." And as the forest exhaled, the centuries of pain and isolation dissolved into a harmony that had waited for 100 years to be realized. The Alpha King took her hand, and for the first time in over a century, they stood together, unbroken, unafraid, bound not by fate alone, but by love that had endured all trials. The moon shone brighter than ever, silver light dancing on the lake and across the canopy, as if blessing their union, marking the end of exile and the beginning of eternity. The wolves circled them once more, a silent chorus, guardians and witnesses, before retreating into the shadows to watch over the couple. Alara and the Alpha King stood hand in hand, heart to heart, eyes locked, souls intertwined. The truth had been revealed. The curse was lifting. And for the first time in 100 years, silence was replaced by hope, solitude replaced by unity, and despair replaced by love. The moon goddess faded into the night sky, leaving behind the lingering glow of destiny fulfilled. The century of waiting was over. The century of silence had given birth to a new beginning. And Alara, the once rejected Omega, now stood beside her Alpha, the king she had loved before time itself had tested them, ready to embrace the eternity that awaited. The forest had never been more alive. Every leaf shimmered with silver light, every stream sparkled like liquid crystal, and every breath of wind carried the whispers of centuries finally set right. The moon had risen high, bathing the earth in its eternal glow, and under its watchful gaze, the final chapter of destiny unfolded. A chapter long foretold, long awaited, and long endured. Alara stood upon the cliff overlooking the heart of the forest, the Alpha King beside her. His hand was in hers, strong and warm, yet tender, as if he feared even for a heartbeat to break the fragile perfection of this moment. The century of silence, the century of solitude, the century of waiting, all of it had led to this instant. They were no longer the girl who had been rejected, nor the wolf who had borne a curse. They were the culmination of fate, forged in pain, resilience, and an unyielding bond. The forest itself seemed to pulse with life, aware that the curse was nearing its end. Wolves that had lived in shadow for centuries shifted around them, restless with anticipation. Eyes glimmered in the dark, tails flicked in tension, and low grow. LS rumbled across the canopy, a choir of guardians who had waited as long as their Alpha King had. One by one, the wolves moved toward the silver light of the moon goddess's blessing, their forms shimmering, morphing, transforming. Muscles rippled beneath fur, limbs reshaped, faces emerged where snouts had been, and finally, the pack of wolves revealed themselves as humans once more, loyal warriors, guardians of the forest, bearers of the bond between Alpha and Omega, cursed and protected by the same ancient forces that had guided Alara for a century. Their eyes held gratitude, awe, and reverence for the one who had survived rejection and exile and for the Alpha King who had endured centuries of suffering to return to his mate. Alara's heart swelled at the sight, tears spilling freely as she watched the pack take their human forms. She realized the full magnitude of her journey. She had not only survived, she had nurtured a kingdom hidden in the forest, had learned the language of the wild, had lived a century among spirits and guardians, and had remained faithful to a bond older than time itself. The Alpha King knelt before her, his human form fully restored, regal and strong, yet softened by centuries of longing. His silver eyes, once the mark of a wolf's curse, now shimmered with the clarity of a king, a lover, a mate who had finally returned home. "Alara," he whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of eternity, "we are whole at last." She stepped forward, letting their hands intertwine, feeling the pulse of his life merge with her own. "We are," she replied, voice steady despite the flood of emotion. "And we always have been." The moon goddess appeared once more, radiant and eternal, her form reflecting the glory of the universe itself. Her light bathed them, illuminating the forest, the humans, the wolves turned warriors, and every living thing that had waited for this moment. "The curse is broken," she said, her voice a cascade of music and power. "The bond has been honored. The Alpha and Omega, fated and eternal, may now walk together, guardians and rulers of the balance, their love a light no shadow can touch." As the goddess's voice echoed through the forest, the Alpha King lifted Alara into his arms, holding her as he had once longed to before time and fate had forced separation. The pack, now fully human, knelt in reverence, their loyalty unbroken, their devotion reaffirmed. And the forest itself seemed to exhale, a sigh of relief and joy that resonated through every stone, every leaf, every whispering stream. Alara rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heart, the warmth of his embrace, the fulfillment of a century-long journey. "We survived it all," she whispered. "Every trial, every rejection, every shadow of doubt. And now, we are together." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his eyes glimmering with tears and unspoken vows. "Together," he echoed, "for all eternity." The moon shone brighter, and as its silver light bathed them, a gentle wind stirred the branches, carrying with it the scent of life, love, and freedom. The century of exile, the century of pain, and the century of waiting had ended. What remained was something eternal, a love forged in hardship, tempered in solitude, and finally released into the world, unbroken and unstoppable. The wolves that had been humans, the forest, the rivers, the mountains, even the stars themselves seemed to bow to the magnitude of this union. Time itself, once a cruel arbiter of separation, now flowed gently around them, honoring the bond that had never wavered. Alara and the Alpha King walked hand in hand through the forest, their presence radiant, their steps in harmony with the land and the pack that had become their people. No longer separated by curse, nor by centuries of silence, they moved forward into a life of peace, power, and love, the rightful rulers of a realm both wild and eternal. And as the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the forest echoed with the song of victory and joy. The rejected Omega and the Alpha King, united at last, smiled at one another, knowing that their love had endured beyond time, beyond exile, beyond the cruel twists of fate. For 100 years they had waited. For a century they had survived. And now, finally, their hearts beat as one. The forest, the pack, and the moon herself bore witness. And the story of the rejected Omega who lived with wolves for 100 years, unaware that her Alpha King had always been by her side, ended not with sorrow, but with triumph, love, and eternity. The curse was broken. The bond was eternal. And the Alpha and Omega walked together, unstoppable, unbroken, and forever in love.